Judith Basin Bench, Montana, September 1876. The air was sharp with the coming autumn, a clean, dry promise of the cold that would soon scour the plains. Most men were racing the season, their axes ringing against lodgepole pine, fitting logs, and stuffing chinking into every gap. But Fergus Dreich was moving rocks, great flat-faced slabs of granite, hauled on a stone boat from a scree slope 2 miles distant. He wasn't building a foundation or a chimney. He was building a wall around his nearly finished cabin, a massive, unmortared ring of stone that had the other settlers talking. Loman Vodder, the territorial land agent, reined in his horse, a man whose authority came from the documents in his saddlebags and the certainty in his voice. He watched Fergus lever a 1,000-pound slab into place, his movements economical and ancient. "Dreich," Vodder called out, his voice carrying the easy condescension of a man who understood timber country. "Building a sheep pen for your family to winter in?" Fergus paused, wiped a line of sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand, and looked at the agent. He said nothing. Vodder gestured with a gloved hand at the growing structure. It was already 5 feet thick and stood shoulder high, a strange gray fortress rising on the treeless bench. "This is timber country, man. You fight cold with logs and fire. A man who walls his house like a Galloway sheepfold doesn't understand the rules here." He turned to the 2 homesteaders who had ridden with him. "Mark my words, this man's foolishness will be the talk of the territory by Christmas." The words spread from Vodder's office like a grass fire. The quiet Scot was building a cairn around his family, a monument to his own madness. Jedediah Sykes, a freighter who had seen his share of strange sights, declared it the damnedest thing he'd ever witnessed. "He's burying his house before the winter does it for him," he told a rapt audience at the land office. The mockery was universal and confident. The consensus was clear. The man was a fool. What did this Scottish drystane-dyker, a man whose trade was a relic from a treeless land, understand about the physics of dead air entrapment that a territorial land agent, a man who had surveyed and sold 1,000 timber claims, had missed? This channel is dedicated to the lost wisdom of the frontier, to the innovators who used observation and old-world knowledge to solve problems others couldn't even define. Their stories are more than just history. They are lessons in physics, engineering, and human resilience. If you believe that true genius often looks like madness to the uninformed, subscribe to this channel and ring the bell for notifications. I promise you will learn how the fundamental principles of thermodynamics were mastered by men with little more than their hands and a deep understanding of the materials around them. Tell us in the comments, what is the most counterintuitive solution to a common problem you've ever encountered? Fergus Dreich was not a carpenter. He was not a logger or a farmer in the way Montana understood those terms. He was a builder, but his medium was not wood. It was stone and gravity. Back in the rolling, windswept hills of Galloway, he was a drystane-dyker, a builder of dry stone walls. He had spent 30 years of his life walking fields, reading the grain of a stone, and knowing with a glance how it would lock with its neighbors. His hands knew the heft of granite, the sharp edges of whinstone, the subtle balance points that allowed a wall to stand for centuries without a speck of mortar. He understood that a wall's enemy wasn't just pressure from sheep or cattle. It was the wind, a relentless thief that scoured the heat from the land. His trade was an ancient conversation with physics, a dialogue carried on with stone hammers and lifting dogs. He had brought his wife, Elspeth, and their 2 children, Ian and Morag, to Montana for the promise of land, a place where a man's labor could build a legacy. But their first winter in a hastily built conventional log cabin had nearly broken them. That winter was a lesson in Montana physics that no one had prepared him for. He remembered the chimney smoke, which should have risen, instead being driven flat by the ceaseless wind, curling back down and forcing its way under the doorframe as a ghostly, frigid vapor. He remembered Elspeth fetching water from the well, and by the time she reached the threshold, a 30-yard walk, the bucket had skinned over with ice. But the image seared into his memory, the one that drove him now, was the candle flame on their small table. All night, every night, it did not flicker. It simply angled 30 degrees to the southeast and stayed there, a living compass needle pointing out the source of the draft that was slowly freezing them in their own home. It was a testament to the sheer kinetic power of the air moving through the tiniest imperfections in the chinking. They had burned through their entire woodpile by February and survived the rest of the winter huddled in every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the air of the one-room cabin. Fergus swore it would never happen again. He had failed his family not through a lack of effort, but through a lack of knowledge. He had built a log box, as he was told. He had built it wrong. The conventional failure of a frontier cabin wasn't a mystery. It was an accepted misery. The problem wasn't the logs themselves. A 12-inch thick pine log has an R value of about 15, a respectable insulator. The problem was the wind. The ceaseless, scouring Montana wind. In the language of thermodynamics, this is convective heat loss. A still layer of air on the outside of a wall provides a small, insulating buffer. But when the wind blows at 30 miles per hour, it acts like a scrub brush, violently stripping that boundary layer away. The moving air molecules collide with the log surface, absorb its heat, and are immediately replaced by new, colder molecules. It is a conveyor belt delivering cold and stealing warmth, running at high speed, day and night. Jedediah Sykes's cabin was a perfect example. It was well built by frontier standards, with logs carefully saddled and chinked with a mixture of mud and grass. He burned a prodigious amount of wood in his large stone fireplace. Yet on a night when the temperature dropped to 10 below zero, the interior walls of his cabin were cold to the touch. The nails driven into the logs from the inside grew white coats of frost, conducting the brutal cold directly through the wood. The heat from his fire radiated outwards, warming the occupants, but it was fighting a losing battle against the constant, convective theft occurring on the other side of the logs. The wind was pulling BTUS, British thermal units, the currency of heat, out of his walls faster than his fire could replace them. To sit near a wall in Sykes's cabin was to feel a persistent, draining chill, as if the wood itself were a source of cold. It wasn't. It was simply a rapid conductor for an invisible, unstoppable engine of heat loss, powered by the wind. The settlers fought back with the only tool they had, more fuel. They fed their stoves and fireplaces constantly, turning acres of forest into smoke, just to stay one step ahead of the cold. Fergus knew this was a fool's bargain. You couldn't outburn the Montana wind. You had to outthink it. And so he began to build. The work was brutal. Each slab of granite had to be quarried from the scree slope, a chaotic jumble of rock left by ancient glaciers. He used levers, rollers, and the sheer strength of his back and shoulders. His sons, Ian, just 14, and Morag, 12, helped where they could, clearing smaller stones, bringing him water. Elspeth watched from the cabin, her face a mask of quiet trust that Fergus clung to like a prayer. The berm rose day by day, a slow, circular tide of stone. He started with the north wall, the direction of the prevailing winter wind, then curved it around the west and east sides, leaving the south face of the cabin exposed to the winter sun. He laid the stones with the skill of a master. This was not a simple pile. It was a drystane-dyker, writ large. The stones were chosen for their shape, laid on their natural bed, tilted slightly downwards and inwards to shed water and increase stability. Crucially, Their faces were irregular, rough, and jagged. He did not seek the smooth, tight fit of a mason. He sought voids. As Loman Vodder rode past on his regular circuits, he'd shout unsolicited advice. "You've got gaps in there a badger could crawl through, Dreich. That won't stop any wind." Fergus would only nod and continue his work. Vodder's mockery solidified at the land office. He told every new claimant the story of the crazy Scot. "Go see for yourself," he'd say, laughing. "Building a wall to hold his cabin down, I suppose. Man doesn't understand that in this country, you need friends. You need a crew for harvest, for a barn raising." The implication was clear. By November, when Fergus needed help raising the last rafters for his small barn, no one would hire out to him. His strangeness had made him an outcast. He and Ian finished the barn themselves, a week behind schedule, as the first snows began to fall. The final structure was monumental. It stood 8 feet tall, encircling 3/4 of his cabin. It was 5 feet thick at its base, tapering to 3 feet at the top. And between the inner face of this massive stone wall and the outer face of his log cabin, there was a gap. An open space, a corridor of still air, 18 inches wide. To his neighbors, it was the final proof of his madness. He had not only built a useless wall, but he hadn't even built it against the house. He had, for no discernible reason, created a cold, dark alleyway around his own home. They saw a sheep pen. Fergus saw a sanctuary. The physics that Fergus Dreich understood in his bones was the profound insulating power of still air. Heat moves in 3 ways: conduction through direct contact, radiation through electromagnetic waves, and convection through the movement of fluids, like air. In a Montana winter, convection, driven by wind, is the great enemy. Fergus's granite berm was a weapon designed to defeat convection completely. First, consider the berm itself. Vodder was right. It was full of gaps. But these gaps were the heart of the design. The irregular faces of the stacked granite slabs created thousands of small, disconnected pockets of air within the 5-foot thickness of the wall. Air is a phenomenal insulator, with an R value of about 5 per inch, but only if it is still. If it can move, it becomes a conveyor of heat. By trapping the air in countless tiny voids, Fergus prevented it from circulating. It could not form convective loops. It became a static, insulating medium. The wind could howl against the outer face of the berm, but its energy dissipated against the immense thermal mass of the stone and could not penetrate the labyrinth of dead air pockets within. The wind was stopped 8 feet from the cabin, but the true genius was the 18-inch gap. This was the second and most critical layer of defense. This space between the berm and the cabin wall created a large captive column of air. Shielded from the wind by the granite wall, this air became almost perfectly still. It was a buffer zone, a thermal moat. The outer logs of Fergus's cabin were no longer exposed to a minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit wind. They were exposed to a column of still, trapped air. This air would, of course, be cold, but its temperature would be significantly higher than the ambient wind-chilled air, and crucially, it would not be moving. It was not stealing heat. It was just sitting there. Fergus had effectively decoupled his home from the environment. He didn't insulate the cabin in the conventional sense. He built a new, calmer environment for the cabin to exist within. He had created a room for the winter, a place where the wind could blow itself out, its convective fury spent against tons of impassive granite, long before it ever reached the wood of his home. The heat loss from his cabin was now reduced primarily to slow conduction through the logs into the still cold air of the gap, and then through the stone. It was a process orders of magnitude slower than the violent theft of convective scour. He had replaced a raging river of cold with a placid, stagnant pond. That winter announced itself with a classic Montana deception, a Chinook. For 3 days in early January, a warm wind blew from the mountains, raising the temperature to an unbelievable 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The snow melted into a sea of mud. Settlers shed their heavy coats, their spirits lifted by the false spring. Loman Vodder noted that Fergus Dreich's strange stone wall seemed to weep water from its southern face, but paid it little mind. The warmth was a welcome reprieve. Then came the crash. On the 4th day, the wind died, and the sky turned a strange, luminous gray. The temperature began to plummet. By nightfall, it was 0. By midnight, it was 15 below. For the next 9 nights, the temperature never rose above minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, bottoming out at minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit. And the northwest wind returned, a steady, relentless 30-mile-per-hour gale that drove ice crystals like airborne sand. Inside Jedediah Sykes's cabin, life became a grim battle. Despite a fire that consumed wood at an alarming rate, the temperature inside hovered at 38 degrees. His wife and 3 children slept in their coats, huddled together in the single bed farthest from the windward wall. A skin of ice formed on the water bucket just 10 feet from the fire. The frost flowers on the nail heads grew thick and feathery. Every gust of wind was an audible and physical assault, rattling the door and forcing needles of cold through the chinking. Inside the Dreich cabin, a different reality unfolded. The roar of the wind was a distant, muffled sound, the fury of a beast locked outside the gates. The single stove, burning a modest amount of pine, kept the indoor temperature at a steady 62 degrees. The candle on the table burned with a tall, perfectly still flame. There were no drafts. Elspeth sat at the table, mending a tear in Morag's dress. Her fingers, nimble and warm, pushed the needle through the delicate fabric with ease. On the corner of the table sat a small wooden crock of butter for the morning's bannocks. It was soft, a simple, mundane fact that was, in this place and at this time, a miracle. The cold had been so thoroughly defeated that it no longer dictated the terms of their existence. They were not surviving. They were living. Loman Vodder was out at dawn on the 3rd day of the deep freeze, riding the boundary of a new claim to log fence posts before the ground froze too deep. The wind was a physical force, a wall of cold that seemed to suck the breath from his lungs and the heat from his bones. His horse, a sturdy gelding named Odin, fought against it, head low, sides heaving. As they neared the northern edge of Fergus Dreich's claim, the horse did something unusual. It veered sharply to the right, stepping behind the massive granite berm, and stopped. It stood there, out of the wind, its muscles finally relaxing. Vodder cursed, pulling on the reins. "Get on, you damned animal!" The horse refused to move, content in the sudden, shocking stillness of the berm's wind shadow. Annoyed, Vodder dismounted, his boots crunching in the crystalline snow. The contrast was stunning. On one side, the full force of the Arctic gale. Here, in the lee of the wall, an almost perfect calm. He grabbed the reins to pull the horse forward, but his thick gloves slipped. Frustrated, he pulled it off with his teeth and reached for the leather with his bare right hand. As he stood there, his bare hand inches from the stone, a thought struck him, a morbid curiosity. He knew what a rock at minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit should feel like. It should feel like a brand of pure cold, instantly searing the moisture from his skin. He hesitated, then reached out and laid his bare palm flat against the rough face of a granite slab. He was expecting pain. He felt nothing. It wasn't warm, not like a stove. It was a profound and absolute neutrality. There was no biting cold, no immediate frost. It was just dry, solid stone, holding a temperature that felt impossibly close to neutral. While the wind-driven cold was actively crystallizing the vapor on the back of his exposed wool coat, The stone face felt inert, passive, disarmed. It was wrong. It defied his entire experience of winter on the plains. His eyes scanned the sheltered alleyway between the berm and the cabin. He saw a small tin can sitting on a ledge of stone about waist high. It was Fergus's tin of axle grease for the wagon wheels. On impulse, he stepped into the 18-inch gap. The air was utterly still. He reached for the tin. He expected the grease to be a solid plug of frozen tallow, as hard as a rock. He pressed his thumb against the lid, popped it open, and looked inside. The grease was firm, but pliable. He pushed his index finger into it, and it yielded, leaving a perfect, soft divot. He stood there, staring at the grease on his fingertip. He walked back to his horse, opened his saddlebag, and pulled out his own tin of axle grease. He tried to press his thumbnail into its surface. It was like trying to dent steel. It was a solid, frozen block he could not mark. He looked from the impenetrable plug in his hand to the soft grease on the berm, and then to the cabin itself. From its simple stone chimney, a thin gray tendril of smoke rose 20 feet straight into the air before being violently sheared off by the wind ripping over the top of the berm. In that moment, Lomenvater's certainty, a thing as solid and reliable as his surveyor's compass, shattered into 1,000 pieces. The fool had been right. The spread of Fergus Dreich's idea happened not on paper, but in the wind-chapped words of working men. Vater, humbled and deeply impressed, didn't write a report to the territorial office. He sought out Gus McAllister, the foreman of a large open-range cattle crew wintering in the basin. He found him in a line shack, huddled over a stove with 3 other riders. Vater didn't talk about R values or thermodynamics. He described what he had seen: the still air, the warm stone, the soft axle grease. He finished his story, looking at the skeptical faces of the cattlemen. "I laughed at him," Vater admitted, his voice quiet. "Called him a fool for building a sheep pen. I was wrong." He looked at McAllister. "That Scot, he didn't build a wall against the winter. He built winter its own room, and he let it tire itself out in there before it ever touched his house." That phrase, "a room for the winter," was practical poetry. It was an idea that could be understood, visualized, and repeated. Gus McAllister told 2 other foremen. They told their crews. These were transient men, riders and shepherds, who moved with the seasons and carried stories from one camp to another. The Dreich Wall, as some called it, became a piece of practical lore. There were no blueprints, no pamphlets. The instructions were simple. Build a stone wall on the north side, but leave a space you can walk through. By the following winter, 7 families in the Judith Basin and 2 over in the Musselshell Valley had built their own versions. The designs varied, using riverstone or sandstone, but the principle remained the same. The fuel savings were staggering, with families reporting they burned less than half the wood of previous winters. The idea spread organically, a testament to the frontier's ultimate arbiter of truth: what worked. What Fergus Dreich built on that Montana bench in 1876 was a primitive but brilliantly effective precursor to a modern building concept known as the ventilated rain screen or cavity wall system. Modern architects and engineers understand that decoupling a building's thermal envelope from its weather barrier is incredibly efficient. By creating an air gap behind the exterior cladding, they allow wind and moisture to be stopped at an outer, sacrificial layer, while the insulation and structural wall remain protected in a pocket of still, conditioned air. Fergus, with his Galloway stones and his memory of the North Atlantic wind, had arrived at the same principle a century ahead of its time. He didn't have the language of building science, but he had a perfect, intuitive grasp of the forces at play. His drystane berm was not insulation. It was a windbreak of immense thermal mass, creating a microclimate of calm in which his simple log cabin could comfortably exist. There is a lesson in the quiet work of Fergus Dreich that transcends architecture. The other settlers saw the winter as an enemy to be fought head-on, a direct assault to be met with the brute force of bigger fires and thicker logs. Theirs was a war of attrition, a constant struggle against a force infinitely more powerful than they were. They believed the solution had to be as violent as the problem. Fergus, however, chose a different path. He did not try to defeat the winter. He did not build a fortress to withstand a siege. Instead, he accommodated it. He yielded space to it. He understood that the enemy was not the cold itself, but the energy of the cold, the kinetic fury of the wind. By building a room for the winter, a place for the wind to exhaust its rage, he disarmed it. He neutralized its greatest weapon, convection, and dealt only with the far more manageable threat of conduction. It was a victory not of strength, but of wisdom. It was a solution born not of confrontation, but of a deep, quiet understanding of the nature of the adversary. On the vast, windswept plains of Montana, the man who knew how to stack stones in a treeless country taught the men of the forest that the best way to win a fight against the storm is to give it a place to rest. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If these explorations of historical engineering and practical wisdom resonate with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these forgotten histories. For our next discussion, we want to know, which modern technology do you think owes the most to a forgotten low-tech ancestor? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, while the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional engineering standards. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.